All right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Peeler Fitness Podcast. Today on the show, I have Mr. Daniel DeBrock. He is the Director of Education at Kabuki Strength. He's a powerlifting national champion. He's written for several publications, including Elite FTS, Breaking Muscle, Kabuki Strength, and Barbend. I also saw that you had like one on T Nation, which is pretty cool. And Daniel reached out to me. He kind of wanted to and I listened to his podcast, the Stack Strength podcast, and basically asking if I'd be interested in having like some sort of conversation with him. And I think that this still just looking at like what he puts out and the content. I think we're in for a really good just a really good discussion today.
Yeah, first off, man, I want to say thanks for having me on. It's cool to be on here. You've got a couple of really cool episodes, and so I'm glad to connect face to face, and then just be able to chat and kind of have a really interesting chat.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's always fun, and I realize that like somebody listens to like what I put out. It's like, damn, like that feels kind of weird, but like it's kind of cool. But
Mhm.
um, so I wanted to go over in this podcast primarily nutrition and sort of like long-term behavior change with nutrition, because a lot of times with coaching, one of the biggest things with really everything is behavior change, and that's the more and more that I do coach people, the more I do find that it is behavior change that is like the number one variable, besides like enjoyment, obviously, in terms of you creating, being fit for life. Because a lot of people go into fitness or they want to lose weight or they want to, gain muscle or whatever, and they are concerned with like the results right now. And unfortunately, that's not how things work. I wish I could be, 220 pounds shredded and, deadlift like 1,000 pounds by yesterday. That's just not how this stuff works. It takes time. And so one of the biggest factors is modifying your behavior change. You're modifying your behavior so that you are able to, one, I think that like just setting yourself up for success with like proper nutrition practices, and then having behaviors that I guess elicit that long term. Um, I guess you can actually keep the weight off. You can actually have that body that you want for life, not just for 30 days, and then go right back to what you were doing, because what you're doing before, like you liked more because what you're doing to get, to lose 20 pounds in 30 days sucked. So
Right.
I know I rambled on a little bit there, but I want to get some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of a big scope. So essentially, I think one of the most important things is first understanding how your behavior is actually going to impact your outcomes, right? Because if you were to ask most people generally do know how to eat well. They generally know to avoid processed foods, generally know to eat protein and whole foods mostly, generally know to stay hydrated. So if you ask them what to do, most people know how to do it. But then when you ask them, okay, how are you going to implement these things? That's where, the actual rubber hits the road. Those are the specific behaviors and action. And that's where most things for most people tend to break down. So a big aspect of that is first the education component, really understanding how some of these things are going to influence their behavior and how adherence is going to be impacted long term, especially when you're developing a lot of these habits. So a really simple example is, let's say, you have an argument with your friend and you're able to kind of keep your cool and sort of have a balanced conversation and sort of diffuse the situation and come to some sort of amenable agreement, right? But now let's say you've only had 2 hours of sleep, you're incredibly hungry, and you've been stressed out because of this work project. How productive is that conversation going to be? Probably not very productive, right? It's probably not going to go as smoothly as in the former example, right? And so that's just one very simple example of how your environment and how several different factors can mediate your behavior and even your desire to conduct yourself in a certain way as well. Because, previously you might have been thinking, man, I really value this relationship. It's important to me that we don't, have this ridiculous argument. Whereas in the latter example, you might be thinking, I'm just exhausted. I can't handle this right now. You're being a prick because I have all this stuff going on. And you know what I mean? So your value structure can kind of shift as well a little bit, or at least what you're prioritizing in the moment. So I think it's really important for people to first understand how many actual variables impact their behavior. It's important that people see it as a skill and not just as a simple thing that you can do. And one of the reasons why I call, like, let's say, dieting a skill is because most people can look at a boxer, for instance, and understand how that's a skill sport, right? But most people wouldn't be able to differentiate between a very high level amateur and a very, very high level world champion professional boxer. Both of them on the pads look exceptionally good. They're fast, they're technically sound, but it's those finer details that are a lot more difficult to pick up, right? And dieting is the same way. So, in the same way that the amateur can do a lot of those things on the pads as the professional champion can, the new dieter might be able to do all of those things like eat this, don't eat that, buy these groceries, don't buy those groceries. But then when it comes to the implementation side of things, they have a substantial gap in terms of skill and ability. A great example of that is you might be perfectly fine throughout the week, but then on the weekends when you're out with friends in different environments, if you go on a trip, if there's a holiday, a birthday, whatever, all of a sudden people fall apart. That's just a very common example that most people run into. And so oftentimes there's a big skill deficit. And so educating individuals on, first of all, what those issues are, what impacts your behavior is really important. And then having them sort of understand it as a skill, right? Because if you work hard and you're always going, doing all these, diets, but they're not, you're investing all this effort, but it's not doing anything, that can really be demotivating. And you can start to kind of erode your self efficacy, and you start believing that maybe I can't do this stuff. Maybe it's just too hard. When in reality, you just are doing, can I swear on here?
Yeah.
Okay. You're just doing stupid shit. Right. And so it's like, well, no wonder, play stupid games, get stupid results. And so, when we're looking at how many different things can influence behavior, these are things like genetics. These are things like your food environment, your actual, geographical environment, your social sphere, your family, your spouse, what your hobbies are, your values, your culture. All of these things kind of mold together to form your behavior and your perspective. And this is kind of like a biopsychosocial type approach. So essentially what the BPS model is sort of an acknowledgement that, in the case of adherence and behavior and nutrition, an acknowledgement that your behavior, your actions, your food choices are influenced by your physiology, by your social context, and then by your own psychology as well. And so when we start looking at it from that lens, it's much easier to see why we're enacting certain behaviors in certain contexts. And that's kind of where this whole conversation sort of starts, I would say. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah. So well, I like we said there was like essentially like the reason it's something that just pointed out to me is that you basically point out there's a lot of different things that in your environment, especially if it's not like a habit already, is going to really test you. You're stressed out. You had a lack of sleep. You had a death in the family, whatever. That can cause people to have different responses in terms of how they address their nutrition, especially because some people like they use it as a comfort, and then some people like myself, I tend to like lose my appetite and just don't want to eat.
Mhm.
Natural skinny kid tendency. But when you were kind of just saying that, one, like set yourself up with a diet that actually looks good and actually will set you up for success in the long run with good habits. And then second, just like I guess understanding like the actual process and like how this is happening are like two big things for actually having this be a long-term habit. So I wanted to ask you, let's say that I guess most people are going to be usually dieting in this attempt to lose weight because most people are overweight or obese. What would you say are some key cornerstones of a successful diet like structure that basically everybody can adopt right now that will result in some success?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll kind of answer this in two parts. So there are generally a couple foundational important things that you need to adopt in order to experience success in the realms of what you're talking about, weight loss, weight management. But then we also need to kind of discuss how to scale that and how to appropriately um, design the intervention, let's say, depending on the individual. Because even if we were to refer back to, let's say there's a handful of things that are impacting your behavior, um, your food environment, your geography, your culture, and we'll just leave it at that for now. Each of those things may have a different magnitude of effect on each person. So it's not like you can say your social environment has 50% impact. it might have 50% for one, it might be 80% for one, it might be zero for another person. And these are just arbitrary figures. It's just to sort of demonstrate the point. So I guess a couple of things that are really important. First, when we look at the literature on long-term successful weight loss and or weight maintenance, and then we also review, prevention strategies and all sorts of different things. There's a handful of things that have consistently been shown to be highly effective. So the first is regular physical activity. That doesn't necessarily have to be in the gym, although if you are, that can be a fantastic tool. But just general active time is incredibly important. And it's funny because a lot of people will scoff at walking. They'll be like, oh, walking, like, what is that going to do for you? And sure, you're not going to get jacked. You're not going to get crazy strong doing walking. But if we're strictly just talking about weight loss and weight management, walking is probably one of the most impactful things that you can do. And there is a mountain of evidence to suggest exactly that. You look at the differences between, let's say, Amish communities versus more westernized communities who have, desk jobs and things like that. The lifestyles are completely different. Amish individuals, on average, get substantially higher step counts, right? And their rates of obesity and individuals who are overweight as well are substantially lower, So, and that's not the only reason why, but it's one very strong correlate, right? So, general physical activity and regular physical activity is incredibly important. Probably doing something that you really enjoy is going to be beneficial because if you really enjoy it, it won't necessarily feel like something you have to do. It's like if you enjoy playing football, when was the last time you needed motivation to go play football with your homies? It's like, so I would say if you're really struggling, start there. Then if you start getting a little bit more advanced, you can kind of progress to different activities, but we can kind of get into that a little bit later. The next thing you want to do is frequently monitor your weight. Now, the frequency of which could be a couple times a week, could be every single day. The reason why that can be so important, now that's not necessarily appropriate for everyone, but generally speaking, it's going to be pretty effective for most people, assuming you don't have some sort of predisposition for, let's say, disordered eating, or you don't have a history of ED, um, eating disorders, not erectile dysfunction, by the way.
Yeah,
So,
folks.
yeah, yeah. So that's really important because you can't manage what you don't measure. And so frequent measuring gives you more feedback. And although at first it might make you kind of feel crummy, a lot of the times it can actually be very empowering because it can kind of like the frequent exposure, the volitional exposure can actually downregulate in some cases the feelings of anxiety around it. It just becomes a sort of normalized thing.
Yeah, I can
And then you can
actually,
continue doing it.
like, I have a history of actually being anorexic before I did start lifting weights, and like for a long time, like I was terrified of the scale, and then and it took me I feel like a pretty decent while before like I accepted like daily weigh-ins, and kind of just got used to it, and like I noticed that ever since I did that, like whenever I tried to gain muscle, it's been leaner. Like I haven't like been like triple bulking ever. The rates of muscle that or better. And then second, kind of like what you said, you kind of learn like how your body kind of responds, and like you're like, oh, I'm up 2 pounds today, whatever. Like I can see like a 5 pound jump one day, and I'll be like, that's really weird. Anyways, I'll go on with my day. And there's a lot of my clients that are I found especially that are overweight or struggling with it. They tend to have a little bit more of an issue initially with like initially like weighing themselves, but as we do it more and more often, it's like they want to beat like their previous low. It's like they're like even more inclined to stay on track, which I think is like probably the biggest quote unquote side effect of daily weigh-ins.
Yeah, and it definitely can be. So again, it's not necessarily appropriate for everyone, but in a lot of cases, it can be highly effective. The third thing is some sort of nutritional strategy. Now, again, a lot of these things are very, very broad and very sort of like vague, but those are going to be the general strategies you want to implement. And if you can adopt some sort of educational strategy, whether that's through working with an RD or working with a coach of some sort, or even a psychologist or whatever it is the individual needs, that can be an incredibly powerful tool to help kind of guide that educational process that will permeate itself into those other activities, right? Um, Now, those are kind of the overarching things that most people will need to do. In terms of the implementation side of things, behavior modification can be very tricky, right? There's a lot of things that impact it, right? So especially if you have, let's say, boredom eating, for instance. Boredom eating has a very strong association with lack of fulfillment, believe it or not. right? So if you generally have a lack of fulfillment, you don't really have a whole lot going on in your life, your propensity to overeat or emotionally regulate yourself through food, it goes up quite a bit, right? So there's a fairly strong association there. So, you know, there can be significant emotional triggers, and there can be like links to trauma and other things that are influencing your decisions for food and or exercise and whatnot. And so when we look at all of those things, we can say, okay, this is pretty complex. We need to make sure that we can do something that you can do on a regular basis, no matter what the fuck is going on. We don't necessarily want to take individuals from 0 to 100, even if we know that eventually they might get here. We can't necessarily push them there, right? It would be the equivalent of saying, oh, you want to squat 700 pounds? Cool, let's load 700 up. And even though you can only squat 300, let's just give it a shot until we do it. It's like, no, that's not how this works. You need to progress them. And so, you need to kind of create a runway for progression. And this is where, from a coaching perspective, this is where a good, thorough needs analysis comes in. Really getting to know the individual, asking them questions about their history, about their diet history, about, what's worked, what hasn't worked, their preferences, food allergies, or do they have any digestive issues? What's their social life like? What are their, what is their partner doing? Do they have a family history of obesity and or being overweight? Things like that. Now, if you're not a coach, you can still just do this inventory on your own. Just kind of get a broader picture of what you're currently doing, and then assess your skills and take inventory, but accurately. Like, where are my actual abilities right now? You know, like, can I adopt this diet and can I stick with it regardless of whether work picks up? If I'm highly stressed, if I don't have enough time, can I do this while I'm on vacation? Whatever. And if you can't do that, then it's probably going to be too big for you starting out. Doesn't mean you can never get there, but at least starting out, that's probably a little too ambitious. So you want to think about starting with things that are going to be super, super easy and require little or no motivation. A really great reference that I like to use is something called the BJ Fogg behavior change model. Essentially, he has like an X and a Y axis, and there's sort of like what's called an action line. Essentially, you want to try and aim for things that require low levels of ability and low levels of motivation. So, for instance, I might tell you, hey, walking is a great thing. Do you need a high degree of ability for that? Well, no. But if I tell you need to walk 3 hours a day, oh, well, now that's going to be way more tricky. If we have a 15-minute workout, well, anyone can work out for 15 minutes. But if I give you the most crazy high intensity workout, even for 15 minutes, that's going to absolutely murder you. So do you have the capacity to do that? Well, maybe not, right? So we need to consider a lot of different variables and implement things that we know we can do and we're not going to hate. So, for instance, a 15-minute walk might be a great start if you aren't walking at all. And then do that for a while. And then once you can demonstrate that you can consistently do that with, let's say, like 95% adherence over 2 weeks or something like that, then okay, maybe we'll increase it to 30 minutes, or maybe we'll do 15 minutes walk and then a 5-minute run. With your diet, maybe we'll just say, hey, I just want you to write down your food every day, what you eat. That's it. Just keep a food diary. Maybe that's what we're doing for the first 2 weeks. And if you do that consistently, then we're going to say, okay, now let's think about adding things. And this is sort of my personal experience. In my experience, adding things versus taking things away tends to be a little bit more effective because it doesn't necessarily give you the feeling like we're on a diet, right? I'm not telling you can't eat chips, chocolate, whatever the heck it is you're normally eating. All I'm saying is let's eat more veggies. And I'm going to provide some parameters around that for that particular client, let's say. But if I'm increasing their fruit intake and their vegetable intake, they're getting more micronutrients, more nutrient dense foods, more food volume, and more fiber, which is probably going to offset their calories coming from more highly processed, calorically dense foods inadvertently. So they're not even going to feel like they're necessarily dieting, but they're going to start reaping some of those benefits of dieting as if they were, let's say. And so that's kind of how I like to look at some of those progression strategies is start real simple, make sure they're competent, build up the consistency and their proficiency. And then once they've done that and they've demonstrated it, like empirically, if you're checking off behaviors every day, you can sort of see their adherence level. Then you start to progress to the next stage.
I really like how you mentioned that adding things instead of taking them away is important because I think another thing that helps out a lot with is client self-efficacy, with basically saying I can do this instead of you throwing them in the deep end from day one.
Yeah.
It's like crap, I can't do this. Like a similar analogy is like when I tell a lot of my clients, and I just put a video out on this, but like it's true in any block of training. You don't want to start out with like too heavy of a weight, or like for week one, things are really heavy and they're really hard,
Right.
you're
Yeah.
gonna have to. It's going to feel like that the rest of the block, and that's not exactly the most exciting thing to do. It's mentally draining, it's fatiguing, and you're just gonna be like, crap, I'm not really getting stronger. I think just feel hard. Whereas if if you're like, okay, let's start off with like a little bit of a lower weight. I know I absolutely can. Do I have room to progress with? They're a lot. Training just is a lot more fun, and one of the things that you did say about like the physical activity components, I tend to. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that most Americans get around 3,000 or 4,000 steps a day. Correct.
Yeah. Somewhere in there.
So if you were to increase that, I usually try to have it be like 1,000, 2,000 steps, like per week, to like get to like a target until we get to like a target step count goal of like 8,000 to 10,000, which is like where I like to have most of my clients say it. And I like having that range because it's way less stressful than if you're like, oh, you have to get 10,000 like every single day. And it's like, well, let's get in like within this range, and that'll probably work best. Um, do you like to go just slowly, like gradually increase steps?
So any sort of progression strategy that I do choose is going to be predicated on the individual's experience and ability, right? So if I'm training someone who's a little bit more advanced and they've demonstrated a really high degree of execution and consistency, then I've got no problem with progressing them very, very rapidly. With maybe going from like just a very basic approach to a very advanced approach, because they've demonstrated that they can do that. But a lot of that stuff is going to be determined in that initial needs analysis section, right? um, and again, for individuals who are just sort of doing this on your own without a coach, the result is going to determine the rate of progress. So let's say you're doing great with 4,000, and then you're like, you know what, I think I can actually jump to 8,000. I actually do have the time, and it's not that big of a deal. I can definitely do this. And you do it, but maybe you're only adherent like 60% of the time. you know I would sort of look at that and say, okay, like I would touch base with the client and say, do you really want to do, like, can you actually do this? If they say yes, I'll give them one more week. If after one more week they're not hitting it like almost every single day, I'm going to regress them. And regressions are not a bad thing either. It's just working within your abilities and giving yourself time to adapt. So exactly like what you were saying, I love your analogy with lifting weights, right? Because if you start out, let's say, on that top end of intensity and volume, where do you progress? Like where are you going to go once you're already hitting top singles and you're like 4 months out from your meet? Like what are you going to do next? So I think the example you gave was really, really good. And rate of progression is entirely predicated on how effectively the individual can execute it and how consistently they can execute it over time.
I think that's a great takeaway for the listeners. Yeah, especially as coaches, it's our responsibility, in my opinion, to keep things client centered as well. Like you said, where you're trying to meet the client where they're at, instead of being like, well, I have some cookie cutter approach, and I use this for all my clients, and if you're not doing it, like you just don't care. Because I always tell, like, I'll say, like, these people probably care a lot. They are hiring a coach. They need somebody to help them where they're at steadily, and if they're ultimately having adherence problems. um I used to, when I was first starting out coaching, I used to think like, oh, it's just my client's fault. It's like, it's just as much the coach's fault as it is like the client's fault, because somewhere within that communication there wasn't, there's some sort of lapse that wasn't made. So I guess now just going into actual like nutritional strategies, how I tend to, you mentioned sort of like, first off, just saying, hey, let's get in the habit of just being aware of like what we're eating. Just track your food. Would you tend to try to initially progress people towards, I guess, would you start with more like a portion size, like precision nutrition sort of things? Like, I think people do get very intimidated by tracking food, and there's a lot of negative stigma around it too, about being potentially disordered eating, or strange. Though I give the analogy, well, it's just like tracking your budget. But for somebody who might be a little bit hesitant to actually track their food and actually use a food scale, what would you do to progress them towards potentially weighing their food? And then maybe eventually, is there a point when you do actually, because I know 3D Muscle Journey does try to move their clients less from tracking rigidly and more towards, again, like lifestyle. This is where behavior goes into play. Like, when would you tell somebody, I guess, like after they've express like the ability to manipulate their body composition, their weight, track their food, etc., to then saying, hey, like, let's try to go towards more of a usually these habits and then not track.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So, um, the thing is, it depends, and I'll explain what it depends on. So, depending on who you are and what your goals are, that's going to have different requirements. So, if you say I want to be a IFBB pro, I don't give a fuck if you don't want to track. You're tracking. There's no option there. You know, if you want to be an elite level athlete, you have to do that. If you don't do that, you don't deserve it, and you probably won't get there in the first place, right? I know that sounds harsh, but that's the reality, and some people just want to find ways around that. If you want to compete at a high level, you have to be a high level performer, and you have to behave like a high level athlete. Now, that is an infinitesimally small percentage of people's clients, are those people who are extremely high performers. So for the vast majority of people, they don't necessarily need to do that. You certainly don't need to track your macros in order to get, jacked and pretty muscular. Like you can be in great shape, like physically, you can have great strength without tracking your macros. So the approach is going to depend on the individual. It's going to start where the individual's comfortable, and then we'll progress to whatever strategy is going to best fit their lifestyle, right? So again, if we have someone who's just looking to generally be healthy versus like some extreme high level athlete, that's a spectrum. So it's like, where does that individual fall on that spectrum, right? And the thing is, that's not a static place either. As you progress, you may change your values. You may actually want to do more. You actually may want to dial things in more and learn more, right? Which is like what happens for most of us. Like I didn't start lifting weights being like, oh, I want to be a champion powerlifter. I want to do this. Like I never did that. I was just like, I just don't want to be skinny and weak and shit, but then you get into it and you start loving it. You want to learn more. And so that's oftentimes how it progresses for people. So it's perfectly fine if the model that you use evolves over time. But to I guess to address specifically what you're saying in terms of the education piece, like if I'm moving someone in that direction and it's appropriate for them, yes, I will get them to track their macros because that's ultimately going to be the most precise way to get the best results, right? So if they can do that and they can stick to it, absolutely, I would go there because that is going to be a superior way. Now, if it's causing a ton of distress in their life, if it's causing just a whole bunch of crap in other areas, I might actually pull that back and focus on other methods of getting them to dial in their nutrition, like a precision nutrition approach, kind of in that stage one, I believe, like the stage 1 or 2, where they're not necessarily tracking macros, but they're utilizing, portion size using, your palm, a handful, fist size, and then the tip of your thumb or whatever. I think that's a great approach as well. And then educating people on food. Now, the thing is, you can actually do both. So, for instance, if we're dieting, right? Well, you're not dieting 100% of the time. There are going to be periods where you're in a maintenance phase. There are going to be periods where you're actively dieting. And so I think, a maintenance phase is a fantastic opportunity to really teach people how to continue eating and maintain these habits while sort of pulling back a little bit from the rigidity, let's say, of the macro tracking and all that stuff. And you don't necessarily need to pull it away all at once, right? Like one, because realistically, if you're doing macros and all that stuff, it can be very difficult to go from all of that awareness to nothing. Even if you're doing everything perfectly, just in your head, it can be a little bit of a mental, mess around. It can be stressful, right? Because you're like, oh, am I going to gain weight? Am I going to lose muscle? Am I going to this? Am I going to that? Right. So one of the things that I'll usually recommend is say, hey, you know what? I want you to continue tracking your food, but on the weekends, I want you to eat, you know, just try and eat, try and quote unquote hit your macros without actually measuring anything. Go out to eat, do whatever you want to do with your friends, but just try and get in the same general, like lots of protein, lots of lean proteins, lots of vegetables and fruits, and get a lot of micronutrients and things like that, whole foods, right? And then maybe if they feel comfortable with that, then we add another day. Hey, so maybe now Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Or maybe we just go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or something like that. So it's not too much in a row, right? And it doesn't kind of cause them to binge or anything like that. And then you can slowly start to kind of build more and more and more until eventually they're just purely eating off of, like, I don't want to say intuitively, but they're eating based on their education and experience, right? And so that's a great way to kind of sort of bridge that gap and get people going into that way. And it might take, let's say several diet and maintenance phases to get them to the point where they can actually fully do it the entire time without actually tracking anything on any days, if that's the objective. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but that's one potential way that you can do that if you're looking to kind of progress someone from tracking macros to, again, I'm hesitant to say a more intuitive approach, but for lack of a better term, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't call it intuitive eating. I think it's like informed eating. Like
Yeah,
like you know what
that's a
your
great way to
body
put it. Yeah.
needs, because it's like if somebody is coming to me and they have actually absolutely no idea about like nutrition, which is why it starts with the education piece. Because like
Mhm.
man, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to, like really smart like business executives or whatever. They just don't understand like the basic calories in, calories out, calorie balance. And
Mhm.
once they kind of do understand that, then you can basically build those habits around the understanding, because I do find that's actually very important, like you said earlier, and just creating that behavior change, that buy-in is actually educating them on this is what actually works, this is what doesn't work. Um, and also, like I had one of my clients yesterday who he's 200 something, like 210 pounds, and like he wants to lose fat, and so usually I keep within 0.5% to 1%, but he wanted to go a little bit faster, so he said, okay, awesome, let's go 1%. He's down like 4 pounds in 2 weeks, and he wanted to push these a little bit more. And I told him why I wasn't really okay with that. And as soon as I explained to him all the reasons why, he was 100% bought in now. He's like, okay, awesome. Now I
Mhm.
understand like why we're doing things the way that we're doing them right now. Um, and then regards to just like not tracking things. I mean, I even think that sometimes I think it's you don't have to go with like a life, especially if you just prefer to track. Like I've gotten to the point where it's so much of a habit, it's made a paper of me. I just track. I get my food scale, I put it on there, I whatever. But also because I have that background of education and whatnot. Say it's Christmas, it's Thanksgiving, I'm at a wedding or whatever. Well, I don't need the food scale. I can look at most foods and most dishes and I'd be like, okay, it's probably around this amount of calories and this amount of protein, and I'm probably going to be pretty dang close, and it reduces a lot of stress that I used to feel around food, especially if I wasn't 100% in a controlled environment. And
Mhm.
it's given me a lot of my life back, and so I personally think like that's the number one thing that I do think it's important to teach clients like how to rely on those habits in social settings so that they don't self-destruct and that they aren't like stressful things, because like you should be able to go out to eat with like your wife or your girlfriend, or go to a family event or a wedding, or like your wedding, say, and not be stressed out about the wedding cake. And also understanding too, like you're in control, like what you also do put in like your mouth, and you can, as long, and again, that's why it's important to have the education. Because I remember when I was in college, I know I'm tangenting right now, but when I was in college, I'd have clients or I have like, roommates who have like two Pop Tarts. I had like my big bowl of oatmeal and like egg whites and like berries, and they're like, "That's so much food." I'm like, "This is about the same amount of calories as those two Pop Tarts." Like, what?
Mhm.
And once you tell them that, it's like dieting becomes a lot less. Oh, this sucks. I'm hungry all the time, and so yeah, if you have like, I don't know, like if you have any more input on, I guess, this whole entire conversation before we move on to a little bit about programming.
Uh, Not really. I mean, I actually really like the way you framed it as informed eating, because that's exactly what it is. It's not intuitive, because a lot of the times intuitive eating is what gets you fat.
I want to
And
eat
I'm saying
donuts and pizza
it's,
all the time. That's what my
yeah,
body
you're like,
says.
oh, this is what my body needs. And it's like, of course you're salivating. You're free. You got a fucking prime rib and a pizza and all this. Like, yeah, that stuff's delicious. Like, no one's denying it. Like, of course you're going to become overweight if you're always eating that stuff. So, yeah, no, I like how you frame that.
I also think that it's just something else to listeners who are like, man, like it's so hard for me to like stop eating these hyper palatable processed foods, and especially because I did my research paper when I graduated was actually on the dopamine like response, like the brain response to hyperpalatable foods. They're like, man, like I just feel like basically what happens is when you eat the more of these hyperpalatable processed foods, you actually get even less of a pleasure response, like salad or something like that. Uh,
Yeah.
and like basically, my biggest advice to people is one, like if you're going from like only eating like hyper processed foods, and you don't really know what a vegetable or fruit is. Just like Daniel said earlier, just try adding something small. Um, into that, try like replace or making like one of your meals what your mom wants you to eat, like what your mom would be like, oh, we would be proud of you for. Like we all know what that means, and they like eventually like progress there. And I talk to a lot of people that are in these habits. Is like for me, it's like I'm motivated to eat that salad and eat that to eat my quote unquote more clean, healthy, nutritious foods. I'm like, holy crap, this is going to make me feel great in the gym. I'm going to have good digestion. I'm going to not have brain fog. I'm going to be able to actually achieve all my goals. And so sometimes it's just like having that mature adult perspective that like, well, these are my goals. This is what I do to get to my goals. Now, but like Daniel did say, this importantly needs to be progressed from where you are at instead of just being like what every single New Year's resolutioner does and why New Year's resolutions fail. It's just like 0 to 100. I don't eat chicken. I don't eat like it's like chicken and broccoli are my gods. Like, and that's just not sustainable for somebody who's used to eating whatever they want all the time. It's too much.
Yeah, absolutely.
So moving on, I think that was a really great discussion. Just a brief overview of essentially because Daniel does a lot of strength training. Obviously a very good power lifter. Um, you know, what are some general principles for somebody that really wants to maximize their strength and muscle mass that people should consider when they are writing programs?
So a big thing that I think is not talked about enough is level of muscularity when it comes to strength. I've literally heard people say that muscle mass doesn't correlate with strength, which is absolutely preposterous. And I'll explain the reason why. So this is where a lot of the times people get conflicted on the research. So if we were to just compare, 100 different subjects, and we were to compare their strength levels and then cross-reference it based on their level of muscularity, no, in that case, they're right. Strength or muscle mass is not necessarily a predictor of strength, right? Inter-individually, so between individuals, right? However, within the same subject, if you build more muscle, you will get stronger, right? And that is, it's so incredibly clear, and it's actually demonstrated in, if we look at Greg Knuckles actually did a fantastic review on this, where essentially he ran like a little review and on his website. I can't remember what the article's called. I wish I could, but essentially what he found was that like muscle mass was predictive of winning in all weight classes in powerlifting. So the people who win are generally the people who are most muscular. This has also been replicated in other research by Megan Bryanton, looking at cross-sectional area of the pecs and successful bench press attempts in powerlifting competition. Right, people with largest chest muscle mass or cross-sectional area of the chest tend to have bigger bench presses. Right, and it's more associated with successful completion of those lifts. So muscle mass absolutely has to be a central focus, especially if you're beginner and early intermediate, even kind of into late stage intermediate. That's also going to depend on how much muscle you want to gain, right? Because not everyone necessarily wants to gain 10, 15, 20, 30 or more pounds of muscle, right? But if you really want to maximize your strength, that is one thing that I would suggest spending a ton of time focusing on, is building your muscle mass. Like, look at you. You've got a jacked freaking body. You're lean and you're big. You've like I've seen some of your lifting videos, right? Like you've got a jacked back, you're lean, you got a lot of muscle mass, which is why you're also very strong, right? I suspect if you were to lose 20 pounds and stay just as lean, your strength would go down a ton. you
No,
know
like actually, like I talked about this actually on Instagram Q&A. I noticed like there tend to be threshold effects of muscularity, or like strength just
Mhm.
takes off immensely. And for me, when I was first starting out, like that was when I got to like 170, and then like I had issues like with my squat for like years,
Mhm.
and I wasn't really getting like that much bigger. And I got to like 180, like I just added 120 pounds to my squat in like a year and basically like 21 months, which is like really
Yeah.
crazy. But yeah, like it's especially I think people needing to understand too with the whole muscle mass thing is like I always tell people like we get into powerlifting to be like jacked and strong. Like jacked is like a really important part of that. Like there's a reason why jacked comes before strong. It's not strong and jacked. It's jacked and strong.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, even outside of just actual, physiological adaptations that improve your force production and your ability to express strength in power lifts or whatever lifts you're wanting to do. Um, there's leverages advantage as well, right? Like, if you're a super heavyweight and you've got massive hamstrings, calves, quads, and like a thick trunk, you're going to get like halfway up the squat just out of like compressing those things alone,
Yeah.
so there's massive leverage advantages as well that are associated with that. So I would make sure that as you're prioritizing strength, you're also prioritizing muscle development, right? And that's going to include eating the right foods, eating sufficient protein, eating the right amount of energy, and doing that over a very long period of time. So making sure that you're spending a lot of your time building strength, but then also, on your accessories, on your assistance movements, building up volume, building up that muscular base. That's one really incredibly important thing. So that's a big thing that I would focus on. Now, within the parameters of kind of just strength development, you'd also have to look at specificity, right? So, like, which exercises are going to carry over to your squat, bench, and deadlift if we're talking about powerlifting, right? It's not always the case that a front squat is going to increase your squat or an SSB squat or a pin squat or a pause squat. You also really have to look at what your individual needs are. So for instance, my squat is quite a bit more than my deadlift, right? It just is because I've got strong legs. I can front squat 500 for like a triple, but my glutes are weak as shit, So like stiff leg deadlift or even conventional deadlift, I don't really train conventional, but I don't even think I've ever deadlift like conventional deadlift 600. You know what I mean? And so, like, that's a pretty big thing. That's a pretty big discrepancy. Like, I pull sumo, right? But you know what I mean? So you need to make sure that the exercises you're choosing are specific to your weaknesses. So for me, my hips are my weakness. So I do a lot of stiff legs. I do a lot of good mornings. I do a lot of things like that. If you're missing on the bench press off of your chest, you need to make sure that you're selecting exercises that bias those particular muscles that might be weak, right? So if you're missing off the chest, typically it's, if it's not a technical issue, it's going to be insufficient chest strength. If you're missing kind of midway, usually the shoulders. If you're missing at the lockout, that's typically going to be your triceps, right? If we're looking at deadlifts, if in the deadlift your technique stays tight, and you're able to blast it up to your knees, but then you can't finish, you probably have some hip extension weakness there, right?
Yep.
If you're squatting and your knees are shooting up, or sorry, your knees are shooting back and your hips are kicking back, you probably have weak quads, right? Again, this is assuming that technical deficiency has been worked on, and that's not it, right? So looking for muscular weaknesses is a big one. Megan Bryanton, she's fantastic. She actually conducted a lot of research on powerlifters on this specific thing and has some great research on it, showing muscular contributions to all of these lifts and what you might need to focus on in order to bias those particular muscles to improve your lifts. So again, if you're missing the squat out of the hole, probably a quad weakness. If your hips are kicking up, probably a quad weakness. If you're finding that your knees are really caving in, it's probably that your adductors are too strong and your hips are actually probably a little too weak. If you're missing the deadlift at in the bottom range, you're probably not bracing sufficiently and your quads are probably a little too weak, right? So there's a lot of different things that it could be. But those are kind of the things that you want to focus on as well from like a programming standpoint. In terms of actual like progressions, I think exactly like what you were saying, Adam, is making sure that you have an intelligent progression strategy. Like, you don't need to add 3 sets in 1 week. You don't need to start off lifting way too heavy. A lot of people start a new program way too ambitious. For me, the first week is honestly just testing. Like, I have a general program, but I have to train the entire week because I do my own programming. I have to train the whole week before I will kind of make those final decisions on exactly how many sets, exactly how many reps, exactly which exercise, because you need to go through it and sort of see how you're going to respond. And then from there, you kind of go. And if you're getting slow progress, man, you're making slow progress. Don't really change much. Once you start to see things stagnate, okay, maybe it's time to add a set here and there. You don't need to change all your exercises. Maybe just add a little bit more sets, maybe add a little bit more intensity, but you don't want to be changing things so drastically that you just don't even know what's driving your performance, right? Is it because I changed from front squats to SSB squat? Or is it because I added 3 sets to Bulgarian split squats? Or is it because I added the leg press? Or is it because I took volume away from the deadlift? You know what I mean? Like, you want to be able to identify what is driving performance. Taking very good notes is also something that's really, really underrated from a programming perspective. So again, like every single week, I will sit down and look at my program. I'll look at my results from that week and my performance, and then I will make the next week of my training. For all of the athletes I train, I do not do longer programming than 1 week. Now, I used to do month-long coaching. I think a lot of people do, just because convenience sake, it's pretty easy. But when I switched to weekly coaching, I noticed a night and day difference in terms of the results I was able to get from my athletes as well as myself, because you just really have your finger on the pulse. And you're
Trying to
really
say
dialed
one
into
thing
what's
about that.
going on. Yeah, absolutely.
Like personally, what I do with my clients is I have predetermined somewhat blocks eventually. Now, initially, I started with like about 2 weeks at a time, but as my weekly check-ins, we're constantly in communication, and we will refine training as it goes on with how we are progressing and whatnot. I like what you said about choosing essentially exercises that are going to target like where you're weakest at, and spending probably like the majority of your training resources there, because we only have so much adaptation that we actually can have at a specific time. Um, and I'm familiar with Megan. That's what a lot of my programming is, based off of her stuff with like choosing other
Yeah, she's great.
exercises and like variations and whatnot. I guess I want to ask you, just as a final round, because I think those are a ton of really good information for the listeners. Um, when you're incorporating hypertrophy programming, obviously that's sort of like the power building. But when you are doing it, let's say if you are, do you tend to keep in the same sort of like, I know that I'm familiar with like you do a lot of RTS style for programming with like, Mike Shear is a huge influence on you.
Mhm.
Um, do you tend to like once you figure out a good training layout week that works in terms of like accessories and whatnot, do you tend to always keep that in there, or do you have maybe some, you know, I guess in terms of like a strength block, or do you tend to have like more quote unquote hypertrophy blocks that are a lot less specific? If somebody is like trying to build muscle, and like how much of like would you actually give to like a competition lift, if like depending upon like if you're a beginner or if you're an intermediate.
Yeah. So, hmm. One thing that I actually have somewhat come back to is training in more dedicated blocks. Like, I used to do more of like a hybrid type training, so a concurrent model, and I still use a concurrent model when I'm training, or when I'm coaching. But how that's changed is now I am kind of going back to what I did a long time ago, which was doing higher rep work, even not specifically with the competition lifts, but with very close derivatives. So I wouldn't get someone to do, and this is just me, I'm not saying it's wrong, but this is just me. I wouldn't get an athlete to do, 5 sets of 10 low bar squat. I just would not. I might get them to do 5 sets of 8 on an SSB bar. Sure, why not? So I want to build up muscle. I want to build up tolerance. I want to build up specific areas, or, like technical aspects. But I don't want degradation. And in my experience, technical degradation often occurs if you're doing the competition lift for a lot of reps. I want them doing like threes, singles, doubles, fives at the most, and that's my experience. Right? I'm not saying that's right, but that's just what I've found. I find that once you start getting really far away from doing singles and triples and doubles, your technical variability just doesn't tend to transfer quite as well. So, like, for some athletes, for instance, like what I might even have them do. So I have one athlete who I'll have hit a single at a three, so like a three RIR. They'll do a really heavy single for their comp lift, um, and then they'll switch to high bar, and they'll do like 4 sets of 8, after that at an RPE 2 to 3.
I do
You
that
know what I
too.
mean?
Yeah.
So it's like they're still getting that stimulus, that high intensity stimulus with a competition specific movement, but then we regress them for their volume to something else. It's not going to have like a negative carryover, or at least it's going to dampen any negative carryover. So I will do dedicated blocks, but I don't necessarily have like a block length. I don't really determine that. That's all determined weekly. Um, unless they're going into competition. If they're going into competition, then it's usually more or less mapped out, you know? But yeah, so I'll usually do things like that, like in the off season. I'll be a little bit more experimental in the off season, have more dedicated to really driving up volume, driving up barbell specific work capacity, driving up movements that are orthopedic in nature that can help them increase their resiliency and reduce their risk of injury and maybe balance certain things out. So I'll have dedicated blocks to like that, but then I still like to incorporate like a concurrent type model where even if I'm doing like threes or fives or something like that on my main movements, I'm still doing maybe 8, 10, 12, 15, maybe even 20 on my accessory movements, you know, like a dumbbell press or tricep exercises or leg press or whatever it might be. That's relevant for that particular individual. I'm not sure if that answers your question or
No,
not.
I think that makes a lot of sense because um, like there's different adaptation. Anybody who's spotted single versus a set of five knows it's completely different. Like I have a personal opinion that five are the worst rep range to PR in. They're just heavy and it's like equally like anaerobic and aerobic in nature, which sucks. Um, but I guess sort of like divvying up like it's all about athlete need really at the end of the day. And like something I always do is I go off of like, well, not only like what seems best on paper, but I ask like my clients a lot like, well, what are you most excited to do? Like what makes the most sense to you right now?
Mm.
And I'll work with them because I found that somebody's like, and this is just something I feel like it might be a little bit unique to my coaching strategy. I feel like if my clients have a lot more say in it, and if they're like, I want to do this, and I'm more like, I always ask them like, what did you like about this block? What do you want to try new? Is there anything else? Like sometimes they're like, no, I love everything. I want to do it. The same thing. Really bought in. They're like, oh, kind of want to try this next. And I guarantee you, when they feel more in control of their training, they're going to be a lot more excited to do their training. They'll probably have better results because that biocycle social model. We're not just like robots.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's a great approach as well because you're simultaneously telling them that, hey, like, you know, I trust your judgment and I want you to be part of the process instead of just sort of like barking orders and pointing fingers. So I think that's a fantastic approach. I like doing a similar thing as well. And I mean, I think that comes down to that sort of client-centered approach that you were talking about. And I mean, if someone is enjoying their training, their output's going to be a lot higher anyway. So probably going to get better results. Like right now, my struggle is because I can't do powerlifting. I had an issue with my head, a little health issue a while back. So I had to switch to bodybuilding. So all the weight I'm lifting is incredibly light. I'm down like 30 something pounds and I just feel incredibly weak and it's terrible. And I don't enjoy my training. Like I genuinely don't enjoy it, but it's temporary. I need to finish it, you know, but this sucks. I'd way rather be lifting weights and crushing heavy squats and stuff like that. But this is just, you know, it's unfortunate, but it's kind of it is what it is, right? But at the same time, if I was paying a coach and this was how I was feeling, I'd be like, man, fuck this guy. You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
yeah.
So I think that's just a testament to your coaching ability as a fact you're having those conversations and opening up that communication channel where they feel comfortable enough to you to actually just be honest and you know asking for things or maybe making suggestions and the fact that you're receptive enough as well to acknowledge that and be like yeah you know like why not because I mean realistically it's like if you don't have a good reason for why you're going to do high bar versus ssb and they say they want to do ssb or something like that it's like yeah fuck why not
Yeah, yep,
like
yeah.
if I don't have a good reason then sure you know.
Yeah, and one of my monthly calls with my clients, my client has been just basically doing like powerlifting training for like 9 months,
Mhm.
loving it, crushing things. And this last training is like, I kind of want to do like dumbbell stuff and like hypertrophy and like not lift heavy that much. I'm like, okay, cool,
Yeah.
like whatever, awesome. Like, are you cool? Like, here's what we'll probably do: we'll do like a submaximal block. So I had a podcast with like Brian Miner where he just did like submaximal straight sets, and like that's what we're doing with him right now. And now he's like super excited to be in training. Whereas before he's like he was already doing dumbbell stuff anyways. So like
Mhm.
me as a coach, it's like I'd be really dumb if I was like, no, you have to do whatever doing like the same thing. It's like no, like yeah, like I would be.
Yeah.
I was my coach said that to me. I'd be like, man, like you suck. Bye. So
Yeah, especially if he's not competitive as well, right? Like a lot of the times people get
I was
stuck in this
training for
mindset, I
fun.
have to do this, right? So it's like,
You don't have to do anything. Like nobody
Yeah.
cares like how strong you are or Jack besides you. Like that's the thing. Like you're in control of your
Yeah.
results and like take ownership of it. And that's the
Yeah.
unfortunate thing. Like it's cool, like seeing like when I said 700 pounds, everybody knew who followed me was like, this is a big thing for Adam. And I'm like, when I did that, I mean, I broke down and cried, and like everybody was like, all like, oh, this is amazing. But guess what? That's like one of like maybe three lifts in your entire career if people actually care. So, anyways, I really want to thank you for coming on, Daniel. I think this is a really awesome conversation. I really enjoyed it. If you want to find you, where can they reach out?
I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, all Daniel underscore DeBrock. But realistically, I'm only ever on Instagram. I'll maybe go on Facebook once every couple months. I post on there, but it's all through like
Yeah,
like a software that does it for me. So I don't really respond to anything there. I'm only really available on Instagram mostly. But yeah, just wanted to say thanks, man. It was a great chat. It was great connecting face to face, and it was really cool to be on your podcast.
awesome. I'll also include your podcast link in the show notes down below. And again, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for listeners for listening. And we'll talk to you guys in the next one.